and we'll do several pages of Frederick Douglass's narrative. So we'll start reading on page 225. So we'll try to analyze the text. We'll look for interesting vocabulary, structures, figurative language, and obviously we'll discuss the main ideas of each passage. Okay, so we'll start reading at the very top of page 225, starting with the words if at any. Okay, so please find this passage in your books. And while we are reading this passage, we'll look for examples of parallel structures, antitheses. We'll look for metaphors, repetition. Right. If at any one time of my life, more than another, I was made to drink the bitterest dregs of slavery, that time was during the first 6 months of my stay with Mr. Covey. We worked in all weathers. It was never too hot or too cold. It could never rain, blow, hail, or snow too hard for us to work in the field. Work, work, work was scarcely more the order of the day than of the night. The longest days were too short for him, and the shortest nights too long for him. I was somewhat unmanageable when I first went there, but a few months of this discipline tamed me. Mr. Covey succeeded in breaking me. I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed. My intellect languished. The disposition to read departed. The cheerful spark that lingered about my eye died. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me. And behold, the man transformed into a brute. Look, in this passage, we have a lot of examples of different literary devices used by Frederick Douglass. When you look just at the beginning of this passage, you will see a metaphor. I was made to drink the bitterest drugs of slavery. That time was during the first 6 months of my stay with Mr. Covey. If you look at letter E question in the margin on the right, bitterest drugs of slavery in line 95 is figurative language. Yes, it's a metaphor, language that communicates meaning beyond the literal meanings of the words. Drugs refers to residue at the bottom of a bottle. What does Douglass mean by bitterest drugs of slavery? How do the examples following this term support his viewpoint? So, of course, bitterest drugs of slavery would mean what? The worst time of his experience as a slave. He's talking about the first 6 months of his life with Mr. Covey, who was actually a slave breaker, as you remember, a cruel, cunning man. So the examples after this explain why his life was so horrible, miserable. Okay, let's go further. Here we have a very interesting example of an antithesis. Yes, look, the longest days were too short for him in line 100. And the shortest nights too long for him. Of course, it's a parallel structure, but with the opposite meaning. So it's an example of an antithesis. Right. Then we have also a very good example of parallelism. Look, my natural elasticity was crushed. My intellect languished. The disposition to read departed. The cheerful spark that lingered about my eye died. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me. And behold, the man transformed into a brute. It's a very important sentence. Why? Because it shows you the mental and spiritual transformation of Frederick Douglass from a man full of hope, full of feelings, into a slave or a brute. Right. Now, speaking about repetition, which word is repeated thrice? Of course, the word work, because that's what they did from morning till night. Work, work, work. Yeah. So, of course, It's a very strong example of repetition because it shows us the conditions of a slave's life at that time. Okay, let's go on. We are now at line 108. Here, Frederick Douglass describes his days off, Sundays. But again, by the time Sunday comes, he's too tired to even move. According to Frederick Douglass, he spends his Sunday lying under the tree, alternating between slumber, deep sleep, and being partly awake because he's too exhausted to do anything else. And look here, he states something very important, that he was basically on the verge of killing himself and Mr. Covey, taking his own life and that of Mr. Covey. And also he mentions two things that actually prevented him from doing so. And these things are hope and fear. So he was still capable of some human emotions and feelings. But anyway, his sufferings were so strong that his life at the plantation was just a nightmare, whether it was a work day or a day off. Okay, in the next paragraph, Frederick Douglass describes a very important episode or incident when, while working in the yard, he felt sick and fainted. And what reaction of Mr. Covey actually followed this incident. So he describes in detail how he and a couple of other slaves were fanning wheat in the yard, and the day was obviously hotter because it was the end of summer. So Frederick Douglass developed an excruciating headache and fainted on the ground. Now, when we read these lines, knowing Mr. Covey, knowing his character, what could we actually predict? Of course, he would not feel sorry for Frederick Douglass. Of course, he would just whip him. He would beat him up. And that's exactly what happened. Let's read this passage, how Mr. Covey reacted to Frederick Douglass's sickness and inability to work. Mr. Covey was at the house, about 100 yards from the trading yard where we were fanning. On hearing the fan stop, he left immediately and came to the spot where we were. He hastily inquired what the matter was. So then the slaves explained to him the whole situation. Look, I want you to pay attention to his reaction. I told him as well as I could, for I scarce had strength to speak. He then gave me a savage kick in the side and told me to get up. I tried to do so, but fell back in the attempt. He gave me another kick and again told me to rise. I again tried and succeeded in gaining my feet, but stooping to get the tub with which I was feeding the fan, I again staggered and fell. While down in this situation, Mr. Covey took up the hickory slat with which Hughes had been striking off the bushel measure, and with it gave me a heavy blow upon the head, making a large wound, and the blood ran freely. And with this again told me to get up. I made no effort to comply, having now made up my mind to let him do his worst. In a short time after receiving this blow, my head grew better. Mr. Covey had now left me to my fate. At this moment I resolved, for the first time, to go to my master, enter a complaint, and ask his protection. So, Mr. Covey gave Frederick Douglass a severe kicking and beating on the head. But it resulted in something very significant. For the first time in his life, Frederick Douglass decided to do something about his fate, to act somehow, to show his free will. So what did he decide to do? To go back to his master, Mr. Thomas, and to ask for protection, to seek protection, to complain, because he couldn't stand this life and this treatment any longer, right? So we can say that here we are dealing with a very important episode, because here we are talking about step 1 on the road to freedom. Look, for the first time in his life, Frederick Douglass decides to do something, to act as a free man, to complain, to seek protection. So then we have quite a long passage describing his journey, his trip to the town, to Master Thomas, which was actually excruciating because it was a long walk. He had to walk 7 miles in his condition. Imagine, he was already sick, he was weak, plus he was beaten up. But anyway, somehow he managed to reach the store of Master Thomas. And he complained, and he actually expressed his fear that one day Mr. Covey would kill him. He would beat him to death. Now it's interesting. Master Thomas's reaction was quite unusual. He didn't believe Frederick Douglass. He actually blamed him for being beaten up. He said, "You must have done something untoward. It must have been your fault." So see, instead of getting protection or understanding or sympathy, he just got some more accusations. And in the end, Master Thomas ordered Frederick Douglass to go back to Master Covey with the first light of the morning. Why? Because Frederick Douglass was rented out to Mr. Covey by Master Thomas. So Master Thomas didn't want to lose his money for the rent. So see, like, human life was nothing to him. So upon arrival on the plantation, Frederick Douglass had a choice, basically 2 choices, either to go back to Mr. Covey and to get beaten to death, or to hide in the woods and die of starvation, of hunger. But luckily, he met one of his fellow slaves. His name was Sandy, who had a free wife, you know. So Sandy gave Frederick Douglass a piece of advice. He told him, go to the wood and get a root, some magical root that should be worn on the right side at all times. And this root apparently could protect Frederick Douglass from any white man and his beatings. Now, here is a question. Could we really believe that a root could have such a power to protect someone from beatings? To be honest, I don't think so. Anyway, Frederick Douglass and Sandy went to the forest, found the root, and Frederick Douglass started wearing it in his right pocket. The next day was Sunday, so Frederick Douglass did meet Covey, who was going to church to pray. Now the question is, when a person goes to church to pray, in what mood is he usually? I believe in quite a good mood. So he's not inclined to beat somebody up. Obviously he didn't. When he met Frederick Douglass, he was quite nice to him. So it was not a good day to check the root, yeah, whether it was magical or not. But then on Monday, the first thing in the morning, when Mr. Covey saw Frederick Douglass, was what? He attacked him with a rope. He wanted to tie him up. He wanted to beat him and probably beat him to death. And here we are dealing with the most important passage in this narrative here, in this book. Why? Remember step 1 that Frederick Douglass took to his freedom when he decided to complain, when he decided to go to his master and seek protection. Now we are talking about step 2, that was even more important. Let's read this passage and then we'll discuss it. So, We'll start from line 251 on page 229. All went well till Monday morning. On this morning, the virtue of the root was fully tested. Long before daylight, I was called to go and rub, curry, and feed the horses. I obeyed and was glad to obey. But whilst thus engaged, whilst in the act of throwing down some blades from the loft, Mr. Corey entered the stable with a long rope. And just as I was half out of the loft, he caught hold of my legs and was about tying me. As soon as I found what he was up to, I gave a sudden spring, and as I did so, he holding to my legs, I was brought sprawling on the stable floor. Mr. Corey seemed now to think he had me and could do what he pleased. But at this moment, from whence came the spirit I don't know, I resolved to fight, and suiting my action to the resolution, I seized Corey Hart by the throat, and as I did so, I rose. So it was not the root, it was just Frederick Douglass's spirit. He decided to fight back. Before, he had just taken all the beatings. Now, he didn't want to take them any longer. He decided to fight back. Right? It was his resolution. Let's see what happened then. He held on to me and I to him. My resistance was so entirely unexpected that Corey seemed taken all aback. He trembled like a leaf. Look here, Frederick Douglass uses a simile to show Corey's emotions. For the first time in his life, Mr. Corey was scared of a slave. So the tables turned. Before it was Frederick Douglass who was always scared. Now it is Mr. Corey who is scared and who trembles like a leaf. This gave me assurance, and I held him uneasy, causing the blood to run where I touched him with the ends of my fingers. Mr. Corey soon called out to Hughes for help. Hughes came, and while Corey held me, attempted to tie my right hand. While he was in the act of doing so, I watched my chance and gave him a heavy kick close under the ribs. This kick fairly sickened Hughes, so that he left me in the hands of Mr. Corey. This kick had the effect of not only weakening Hughes, but Corey also. When he saw Hughes bending over with pain, his courage quailed. He asked me if I meant to persist in my resistance. I told him I did, come what might, and he had used me like a brute for 6 months, and that I was determined to be used so no longer. So see, here, Frederick Douglass arrived at this determination not to be used like a brute any longer. It's a very important step. With that, he strove to drag me to a stick that was lying just out of the stable door. He meant to knock me down, but just as he was leaning over to get the stick, I seized him with both hands by his collar and brought him by a sudden snatch to the ground. By this time, Bill came. Corey called upon him for assistance. Bill wanted to know what he could do. Corey said, "Take hold of him, take hold of him." Bill said his master hired him out to work and not to help to whip me. So he left Corey and myself to fight our own battle out. We were at it for nearly 2 hours. Corey at length did let me go, puffing and blowing at a great rate, saying that if he had not resisted, he would not have whipped me half so much. The truth was that he had not whipped me at all. I considered him as getting entirely the worst end of the bargain, for he had drawn no blood from me, but I had from him. The whole 6 months afterwards that I spent with Mr. Corey, he never laid the weight of his finger upon me in anger. He would occasionally say he didn't want to get hold of me again. No, thought I, you need not, for you will come off worse than you did before. Now let's look at question K. What happens in this passage? What is Douglas's purpose in relating this incident? What happens? As we said, for the first time in his life, Frederick Douglass decides to fight back. And look here, we are not talking about a beating. We are talking about a battle. Frederick Douglass is using the word battle to describe this experience, this incident. Because here, it's not Covey who has the upper hand. It's Frederick Douglass who draws blood from Covey. So yes, it's not a beating. It's a fight. It's a fair battle. Why is this episode important? It's a turning point. From now on, Frederick Douglass realizes that he can fight back, that he can be a free man. And look, after that, Covey never laid a finger upon him in anger. So it is a turning point in his career as a slave. Now let's continue. The last passage is very interesting because here, even the diction, the language changes. It becomes more descriptive, more emotional, and more poetic. While I'm reading this passage, I want you to look for examples of parallel structures, find examples of antitheses, try to find metaphors, repetition, yeah, things like that. And just pay attention to how the ideas are conveyed in this passage. This battle with Mr. Covey was the turning point in my career as a slave. It rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom and revived within me a sense of my own manhood. It recalled the departed self-confidence. It inspired me again with the determination to be free. The gratification afforded by the triumph was a full compensation for whatever else might follow, even death itself. He only can understand the deep satisfaction which I experienced, who has himself repelled by force the bloody arm of slavery. I felt as I never felt before. It was a glorious resurrection from the tomb of slavery to the heaven of freedom. My long crushed spirit rose, cowardice departed, bold defiance took its place, and now resolved that, however long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact. I did not hesitate to let it be known of me that the white man who expected to succeed in whipping must also succeed in killing me. From this time, I was never again what might be called fairly whipped, though I remained a slave 4 years afterwards. I had several fights, but was never whipped. Look at the language of this passage. Here he gives you this emotional rendition of what he experienced as a human being. He didn't feel like a slave any longer. He felt he was a free man at heart. Remember, he was hopeless. Now he has hope. He never believed he would be free again. Now he does believe, and he's sure of that. Now look at the language itself. We have several examples of metaphors, and the passage opens with a very beautiful metaphor describing his emotional condition. He says, it rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom and revived within me a sense of my own manhood. Here, this kind of hope for being free is compared to embers, this dying fire, but now it's been rekindled, it's been revived. The fire is burning bright again. He's sure he would be free one day. Now, another metaphor that is used here is the bloody arm of slavery. Why the bloody arm? Because just now we read about all those punishments and beatings and whippings that slaves had to endure. Of course, we are talking about the bloody arm of slavery. Another amazing metaphor is it was a glorious resurrection, coming back to life, yes, from the tomb of slavery to the heaven of freedom. Of course, a tomb of slavery. this dark place where dead are being buried, because he didn't have a life. But now he's a heaven of freedom, right? Now, speaking about parallel structures, there are quite a lot. Like one of them I could give you is this. My long crushed spirit rose. Cowardice departed. Bold defiance took its place. Again, it's a very important parallel structure. Why? Because it deals with the spiritual awakening, those changes that are happening within his heart. He's becoming a man, not a brute, not a slave. Now, speaking about repetition, the word wept is repeated in the last passage. Why? Because weeping was a symbol of slavery. Now he's not being whipped. Yes, he had some fights, but he didn't endure any more whippings. Now let's look at question L, the last one here. How might this description have affected Douglas's reader? Of course, here the answers will be quite personal. In my opinion, like when I read this passage, I'm moved deeply. I basically get a lot of respect for Frederick Douglass, that he had enough inner strength to overcome all his sufferings, all his terrible experiences, to actually revive this feeling of hope and to become a man again. So that's all. Next week, we'll continue analyzing the story and we'll do some exercises in the workbook. So thank you and goodbye.